The heavy scent of incense and expensive perfume cannot hide the sharp metallic tang of blood on the hem of a queen's gown. To the nobles gathered in the Great Hall of Westminster, the garment is a miracle of gold thread and crimson silk, but to the woman who sat in a freezing attic for 72 hours to finish it, the dress is a record of pain. Every stitch is a silent witness to a life lived in the shadows of history. We often hear of the kings who fought wars and the architects who built cathedrals, but we rarely speak of the women whose needles held the very fabric of medieval society together. If you are fascinated by these hidden chapters of human history and the untold stories of those who built our world from the shadows, please subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to keep uncovering the secrets history tried to erase. Imagine a world where your survival depends on a piece of steel no longer than a finger. In the year 1350, London is a city of brutal contrasts. Outside, the air is thick with the stench of the Thames and the fear of the Black Death. Inside the royal chambers, the demand for luxury has never been higher. For a medieval seamstress, the needle was her only weapon against starvation, yet it was a weapon that slowly destroyed her. By the age of 25, her eyesight would begin to fail from working by the light of a single tallow candle. By 30, her fingers would be so heavily calloused and scarred that she would lose the fine motor skills required for the most delicate embroidery. Consider the case of a woman named Magoda, who lived in Paris during the late 13th century. Historical records show she was one of the few women mentioned by name in the tax assessments of the time. She was not just a laborer, she was a master of her craft. Yet even a woman of her skill lived in constant fear of the Men's Tailors Guild. These powerful organizations controlled the industry with an iron fist. They argued that women were naturally inferior and should only be allowed to perform simple repairs or sew undergarments. But the truth was different. The nobles wanted the delicacy that only a woman's touch could provide. This created a dangerous gray market where women like Magota practiced their art in secret, knowing that at any moment their tools could be seized and their livelihoods destroyed by a guild inspector. The blood on the silk was not just a metaphor. Medieval needles were made of iron or bone, and they were prone to snapping or rusting. Without the protection of a modern thimble, a seamstress's fingertips were constantly punctured. In the dim light, a single slip of the hand could ruin a yard of velvet that cost more than a commoner's yearly wage. If she stained the fabric with her blood, she would not be paid. She might even be beaten or imprisoned. So she learned to sew with a scrap of old linen wrapped around her thumb to catch the red drops before they hit the precious gold cloth. This was the silent sacrifice behind the majesty of the Middle Ages. As we peel back the layers of this forgotten history, we find that the seamstress was more than just a servant. She was a keeper of secrets. She knew which lord was gaining weight and trying to hide it with a clever fold of fabric. She knew which lady was wearing illegal lace imported from Flanders in defiance of the king's laws. She saw the underside of the velvet where the threads were knotted, and messy mirrors of the messy, complicated lives of the elite. Every time a queen stepped onto a dais, she was literally supported by the labor of women who were forbidden from standing in her presence. This first chapter of our journey takes us into the heart of the workshop. It is a place of silence broken only by the rhythmic snip of shears and the soft hiss of silk being pulled through a frame. It is here that the struggle for independence began. In a world that told women they were property, the ability to create something beautiful and essential was a form of power. It was a power that the guilds tried to legislate away, but they could never truly kill the skill of the needle. as the sun sets over the medieval skyline and the workshops grow dark. We must ask ourselves how these women managed to navigate a system designed to keep them poor and invisible. The answer lies not just in their skill with thread, but in their ability to organize, to rebel, and to survive against impossible odds. The silk may have been stained with blood, but the spirit of the woman who held the needle remained unbroken. This was only the beginning of a battle that would last for centuries. Every master of the needle began their journey not with a golden thread, but with a humble piece of coarse linen and a heart full of trepidation. In the 13th and 14th centuries, a girl's education did not happen in a schoolroom, but at the tip of a needle. From the moment her fingers were large enough to hold a sliver of bone or iron, she was taught that her worth was measured by the precision of her stitches. For most, this was a domestic duty, a way to mend the family's tunics and keep the winter cold at bay. But for those destined for the professional workshops of London, Paris, or Florence, the path was far more grueling. This was the cradle of the needle, where the playfulness of childhood was systematically traded for the precision of an industry. To understand the making of a medieval seamstress, we must look at the apprenticeship system. It was a contract of survival. A father would bring his daughter, often no older than 7 or 8, to the doorstep of a mistress seamstress or a master tailor. A formal agreement was struck. In exchange for several years of her life, the girl would be fed, clothed, and taught the secrets of the craft. But the term secret was no exaggeration. These techniques were the intellectual property of the time. The girl was not just a student, she was an indentured servant. She lived in the attic of the workshop, sleeping on a pallet of straw amidst the scraps of fabric she had spent 14 hours a day cutting. Her day began before the sun touched the cathedral spires and ended long after the city gates were locked. The first year of an apprenticeship was rarely spent sewing silk. Instead, it was a year of preparation and punishment. The young girl was the fetcher of water, the scrubber of floors, and the preparer of needles. She had to learn the temperamental nature of different fibers. She learned that wool from the English countryside felt different between the fingers than the fine linens of Flanders. She learned that silk was a living, breathing thing that could be ruined by the sweat of a nervous palm. She was taught to sharpen needles with abrasive stones until they could pierce the skin without a sound. This was the foundation. Before she could create beauty, she had to understand the raw materials of the earth. She had to become an extension of the tools themselves. Consider a young girl in 14th century Bruges. Let us call her Elena. At 9 years old, Elena's world was reduced to the space between her eyes and the hoop of her embroidery frame. She began with the basic running stitch, the simplest line of thread. She would repeat this thousands of times until her hand moved with the regularity of a heartbeat. If a single stitch was out of alignment, the mistress would rip the work out, and Elena would begin again by the light of a flickering oil lamp. There was no room for error, because in the professional world, an error was a financial loss. The pressure on these children was immense. They were the invisible engines of the fashion economy, and their tiny hands were responsible for the intricate details that defined the status of the ruling class. As Elena progressed, she moved to more complex maneuvers. She learned the backstitch for strength, the whip stitch for edges, and the dreaded French knot for texture. But the true test of a seamstress was the invisible seam. To join two pieces of heavy velvet so perfectly that the garment appeared to have grown from a single piece of cloth was the mark of a professional. This required a level of concentration that modern minds can barely comprehend. There were no machines to hide behind. Every millimeter of thread was pulled by hand. Every tension of the fabric was felt by the fingers. By her 3rd year, an apprentice's hands would be permanently calloused. The soft skin of childhood was replaced by a leathery toughness, a physical shield against the constant bite of the needle. But the apprenticeship was not just about the hands, it was about the eyes. A professional seamstress had to develop what was known as the microscopic gaze. She had to be able to count the threads in a piece of fine linen without the aid of a magnifying glass. She had to distinguish between a dozen shades of blue in a dim workshop, knowing that the midday sun would reveal any mismatch. This constant strain on the eyes led to a unique professional hazard. Many seamstresses began to lose their near sight before they reached their 20th birthday. They were trading their vision for the ability to create the visionary garments of the nobility. The social hierarchy within the workshop was as rigid as the church itself. The young apprentices were at the bottom, followed by the journeywomen who had finished their training, but lacked the capital to start their own shops. At the top was the mistress who held the power of life and death over her subordinates. For a young girl like Elena, the mistress was both a teacher and a tyrant. Discipline was often enforced with the very tools of the trade. A heavy wooden ruler across the knuckles was a common correction for a sloppy hem. In some workshops, if an apprentice ruined a piece of precious cloth, she might be denied food for a day, or forced to work through the night to pay for the damage. Yet despite the hardship, there was a sense of sisterhood that formed in these cradles of industry. In the silence of the workshop, the women and girls would sing. They sang ballads of lost loves and holy saints, but they also sang songs that acted as a metronome for their needles. The rhythm of the song kept the pace of the work. It was a collective heartbeat. In these moments, the workshop became more than a place of labor. It became a space where women shared knowledge that went beyond sewing. They shared herbal remedies for their aching backs, stories of the world outside, and the secret strategies they would need to survive once their apprenticeship was over. By the time an apprentice reached 16, she was no longer the frightened child who had arrived at the doorstep. She was a technician. She knew how to manipulate the bias of a fabric to make it drape like water. She knew how to hide a pocket in a seam or reinforce a bodice so it could hold the weight of 100 pearls. She had passed through the cradle of the needle and emerged as a professional. But the world she was entering was not a welcoming one. As a woman, she would find that the legal systems of the medieval world were designed to prevent her from ever owning the fruits of her labor. The skills she had spent a decade perfecting were about to become her greatest asset and her most dangerous liability. In this chapter of her life, the seamstress had mastered the stitch, but she had yet to master the society that demanded her work. She was ready to move from the apprentice's bench to the journeyman's road, but the road ahead was blocked by the powerful men who controlled the guilds. Her childhood was over, buried under layers of silk and wool, and the true battle for her independence was only just beginning. Every hour spent in that dim attic, every drop of blood spilled on a practice cloth had prepared her for a fight that would define the rest of her life. She was no longer just Elena, the girl from Bruges. She was a woman of the needle, a creator of order in a chaotic world. While the apprentice was mastering the needle, the world around her was building walls of parchment and law to keep her in her place. To understand the medieval economy, we must understand the guild. These were not just clubs or associations, they were the gatekeepers of survival. In the bustling streets of London, Paris, and Cologne, the guilds held a total monopoly. If you were not a member, you did not exist in the eyes of the law. and for the vast majority of the Middle Ages to be a woman was to be permanently excluded from this brotherhood. This was the invisible ceiling, a barrier made of tradition and greed that transformed the simple act of sewing into a criminal offense. The conflict centered on a single sharp distinction that seems trivial today, but was a matter of life and death in the 14th century, the distinction between tailoring and sewing. In the eyes of the male-dominated guilds, a tailor was an architect of cloth. He had the legal right to cut the fabric to shape the garment and to create the silhouette of a gentleman or a lady. The seamstress, however, was seen as a mere laborer. She was allowed to join pieces of fabric that had already been cut by a man, or to perform the lowly task of mending old rags. To pick up the shears and cut a piece of new silk was an act of rebellion. It was an infringement on the professional territory that men guarded with a ferocity that often turned violent. Imagine the atmosphere of the guild hall. Men in fur-lined robes sat around heavy oak tables drafting statutes that specifically targeted women. They argued in the language of the church and the university, claiming that women lacked the mathematical mind required for complex tailoring. They claimed that the female constitution was too weak to handle the heavy shears or the pressing irons. But the reality was far more cynical. The men saw the growing skill of women as a threat to their prices. Women worked for less. Women were often more meticulous. And women were increasingly being sought after by the nobility, who preferred the delicate touch of a female hand for their most intimate garments. This tension led to what can only be described as a shadow war. Because the guilds could not stop the demand for female labor, they resorted to state-sanctioned harassment. In Paris, the Corporation des Tailleurs employed a small army of inspectors known as the jurés. These men had the legal authority to enter any home or workshop without a warrant. They would burst through doors in the middle of the night searching for signs of illegal tailoring. If they found a woman holding a pair of shears, or if they found a garment that looked too professional, it would be seized on the spot. The fabric, which might represent a month's wages for the woman, was confiscated. The woman herself would be dragged before a guild court, fined, or even banned from the city. There is a documented case from the late medieval period involving a widow in London who attempted to keep her husband's shop open after his death. According to guild law, a widow could sometimes manage the business, but she was forbidden from training new apprentices or taking on new work that involved cutting cloth. She was a ghost in her own workshop. The guild inspectors visited her weekly, counting every yard of wool in her inventory and questioning her neighbors to see if they had heard the sound of her shears. They wanted her to fail. They wanted her to marry another guild member so the property and the skill would remain within the brotherhood. Her resistance was not just about business. It was a battle for her identity as an independent human being. But the seamstresses were not passive victims. They were masters of the gray market. Knowing that they could not win in the courts, they won in the streets. They developed a complex system of lookouts. Children playing in the gutters were paid with scraps of bread to whistle when they saw a guild inspector approaching. In an instant, the illegal garments would be hidden in false ceilings or buried under piles of firewood. The workshop would transform from a professional studio into a humble domestic scene with women simply mending their own aprons. The speed and coordination of these transitions was a testament to the organizational brilliance of the women who lived on the edge of the law. The guilds also used the sumptuary laws as a weapon. These were the rules that dictated what each class of person could wear. A merchant was forbidden from wearing velvet. A peasant was forbidden from wearing certain shades of blue. The tailors' guilds acted as the fashion police, reporting any seamstress who helped a client bypass these laws. If a seamstress was caught making a silk bodice for a wealthy merchant's daughter, she was not just breaking guild rules, she was threatening the social order of the entire kingdom. The needle in the hands of a woman was seen as a tool of social chaos. Consider the psychological toll of this constant surveillance. To be a professional woman in the Middle Ages was to live in a state of perpetual anxiety. You could be the most talented artist in your city, but if you did not have a father or a husband to shield you from the guild, you were a criminal. This forced many women into desperate alliances. Some worked as subcontractors for male tailors, who would take the credit and 60% of the profit in exchange for legal protection. Others formed secret sisterhoods, essentially underground guilds, where they shared patterns and resources away from the prying eyes of the men. The climax of this struggle often occurred during the great trade fairs. These were the few times a year when the guilds lost some of their control as merchants from across Europe flooded the city. Seamstresses would smuggle their work into the fairs hidden in baskets of wool or under loads of grain. They would sell their embroidery and their finely stitched veils directly to international buyers. For a few days, they tasted the freedom of a free market where their skill was the only thing that mattered. But when the fair ended, the guild walls would close in again tighter than before. This chapter of history reveals the true meaning of the word professional. For the men, it meant a title, a robe, and a legal monopoly. For the women, it meant a secret war, a constant threat, and the courage to keep sewing in the dark. The invisible ceiling was not just a metaphor, it was a cage made of law. Yet inside that cage, the seamstresses were perfecting techniques that would eventually make the guild tailors obsolete. They were learning to drape, they were learning to fit, and they were learning how to navigate a world that was determined to erase them. The struggle for the right to sew was the first step in the long road toward economic independence. Every fine paid, every garment seized, and every midnight raid only served to strengthen the resolve of the women. They knew that as long as humanity had a desire for beauty, they would have a job. The guilds had the laws, but the women had the skill. And in the long run, the needle would prove to be more powerful than the parchment. As the medieval era began to fade into the Renaissance, the cracks in the invisible ceiling were starting to show, and the light of a new economy was beginning to peek through. We must ask ourselves what it takes for a person to persist in a craft that the law calls a crime. It takes more than just skill. It takes a strategic mind and a community of sisters who are willing to hide your secrets. The guild wars were not just about money, they were about the right to exist as a professional woman. And as we will see, the seamstresses of the Middle Ages were just getting started in their fight for the throne of the fashion world. A sharp, rhythmic rap at the door in the dead of night was the sound every independent seamstress in 14th century London feared most. It could be a desperate client with a ruined gown, or it could be the guild inspectors coming to seize her life's work. In the shadows of the medieval city, a second economy was breathing. While the great guild halls glowed with the light of expensive beeswax candles, the true innovation of fashion was happening in the damp cellars and cramped attics where women worked in total silence. This was the underground thread, a network of labor that was technically illegal but absolutely essential to the pulse of the city. To walk through the door of a clandestine workshop was to enter a world of organized chaos. Because these women could not legally own professional premises, they turned their homes into fortresses of industry. Every piece of furniture had a double purpose: A heavy oak dining table might have a hollow space beneath its surface to hide rolls of forbidden Italian silk. A pile of laundry in the corner was often a decoy covering a half-finished doublet designed for a merchant who was not legally allowed to wear it. The very air in these rooms was thick with the dust of fabric and the tension of being an outlaw. The underground economy relied on a code of silence that was as strong as any religious vow. The seamstress, her apprentices, and her clients were bound by a shared risk. If one was caught, they all faced ruin. This created a unique social bond across class lines. A noblewoman might visit a back-alley workshop to have a bodice fitted with a level of intimacy she would never show her peers. In the dim light of a hidden room, the social hierarchy shifted. The seamstress with the needle in her hand and the knowledge of the lady's secrets was the one in control. She knew the scars, the pregnancies, and the insecurities that the heavy velvet of the court was designed to hide. One of the most fascinating aspects of this underground world was the logistics of fabric. Fine cloth was the currency of the era, and it was strictly regulated. To obtain high-quality wool or silk without a guild license required a network of smugglers and corrupt merchants. Seamstresses often struck deals with sailors and travelers at the city docks. A bolt of silk from the east might be hidden inside a shipment of grain or wrapped around a barrel of wine. These women were not just artisans, they were master logisticians managing a supply chain that bypassed the official gates of the city. They understood the value of every square inch of fabric. Scraps that were too small for a sleeve were saved to create intricate patchwork or to line the pockets of the poor. In the underground economy, nothing was ever wasted. The role of the runner was vital to the survival of the hidden workshop. Usually, these were young children or elderly women who appeared invisible to the guild inspectors. They carried small bundles, wrapped in dirty linen, through the winding streets. To a passerby, it looked like a grandmother taking laundry to the river. But inside the bundle was a priceless lace collar or a set of silk ribbons. These runners were the nervous system of the underground thread, moving information and goods between the workshops and their clients. They knew which streets to avoid, which guards could be bribed with a copper coin, and which chimneys were smoking, indicating a workshop was in full production. But what drove these women to live a life of such constant danger? The answer was simple: economic survival and the taste of independence. An independent seamstress, working underground, could often earn more than a woman working legally as a servant in a noble household. She had the freedom to choose her clients and to set her own pace, even if that pace was exhausting. For many, this was the only way to support children or elderly parents in a world that offered women very few paths to a decent wage. The risk of the guild's heavy fines or the shame of the pillory was a price they were willing to pay for a life that was their own. There is a sense of rebellion in every stitch of an illegal garment. When a seamstress used a prohibited technique like the intricate goldwork embroidery reserved for the clergy, she was making a political statement. She was asserting that her skill was not a commodity to be controlled by men in robes. The underground thread was a slow, steady erosion of the guild system. By providing a better product for a lower price, the women were proving that the guild's monopolies were based on power rather than quality. They were the original disruptors of the fashion industry, working from the shadows to change the way the world looked at clothing. As the years passed, these underground networks became more sophisticated. Some seamstresses formed secret cooperatives, sharing the cost of a single legal front shop. On the outside, the shop looked like a simple haberdashery, selling needles and thread. But behind a hidden door in the back, the real work was being done. Dozens of women would be sewing in shifts, their needles moving in a blur of motion. They developed their own internal systems of quality control and their own insurance funds to help any sister who was caught by the authorities. This was the birth of a professional identity that did not rely on a royal charter or a guild seal. However, the psychological weight of this existence cannot be ignored. To live underground was to live with a constant eye on the door. It meant never being able to put your name on your best work. It meant having to lie to neighbors and officials. The isolation was profound, yet it was this very isolation that allowed the seamstresses to experiment. Away from the rigid rules of the guilds, they could try new cuts, new shapes, and new ways of draping fabric. The underground workshops became laboratories of style. Many of the fashion revolutions of the later Middle Ages, including the move toward more fitted and tailored silhouettes, had their roots in these secret spaces. The underground thread was more than just a way to make a living. It was a testament to the resilience of the female spirit. In a society that tried to categorize and contain them, the seamstresses found the gaps in the system and turned them into opportunities. They turned their homes into factories, their neighbors into allies, and their needles into tools of liberation. The history of fashion is usually written by the names of the great houses and the famous designers, but the real story was woven in the dark by thousands of anonymous women whose names have been lost to time. As the dawn breaks over the medieval city and the hidden workshops finally grow quiet, we realize that the underground thread was never really broken. It simply changed form as the centuries passed. The courage it took to sew an illegal seam is the same courage that has driven women for generations to fight for their place in the professional world. In the next chapter of our story, we will look at the physical toll of this labor, the tools that were both instruments of creation and objects of torture. But for now, we leave the seamstress in the shadows, her needle moving steadily by the light of a fading candle, weaving a future she would never live to see, but one she was undeniably creating. The secrets kept in the seams of the underground were not just about fashion, they were about the human heart's desire for autonomy. Every illegal bodice was a victory. Every smuggled yard of silk was a defiance. And as the inspectors walked the streets unaware of the hive of activity beneath their feet, the seamstresses of Europe continued to sow the seeds of a revolution that would eventually tear the guild system apart. To hold a tool is to invite it to change you. In the hands of a medieval seamstress, the needle was not an inert object. It was a living predator that slowly reshaped her body to fit its demands. We often admire the tapestry or the velvet gown as a finished masterpiece, but we ignore the machines that produced them, the human bodies that were ground down by the very instruments of their craft. In this chapter, we look past the beauty of the stitch to the brutal reality of the tools of survival and torture. The needle itself was the primary instrument of this transformation. Unlike the stainless steel needles of today, which glide through fabric with minimal resistance, medieval needles were often made of iron, brass, or even bone. Iron needles were prone to rusting, especially in the damp climates of northern Europe. A seamstress had to spend hours polishing her needles with abrasive sand or leather to ensure they would not snag the precious silk. Even then, the friction was immense. Every time she pushed that needle through a layer of heavy wool, she was subjecting her joints to a micro-trauma that repeated thousands of times a day. For much of the medieval period, the thimble as we know it was a luxury or a rarity. Many women used a simple scrap of leather wrapped around their middle finger, or they used nothing at all. The result was a permanent deformity of the fingertips. Over years of labor, The skin would become so thick and scarred that it lost all sensation. But before that calloused protection formed, the pain was constant. Infection was a silent killer in the workshop. A single deep puncture from a rusted needle could lead to blood poisoning, a death sentence in a world without antibiotics. The needle was truly a double-edged sword. It provided the means to eat, but it also offered a path to the grave. Then there was the thread. We think of silk as soft, but in its raw state, and when pulled repeatedly through fabric, it acts like a fine wire. It cuts into the skin. Seamstresses often had deep grooves worn into their fingers, where the thread had passed day after day, year after year. This was not just a surface wound. It was a permanent remodeling of the hand. Archaeological excavations of medieval cemeteries have identified the remains of seamstresses by these specific skeletal markers. Their finger bones show unique wear patterns, and their vertebrae are often fused or twisted into a permanent curve. This brings us to the most visible toll of the craft, the posture. A professional seamstress spent 14 to 16 hours a day, hunched over a frame or a lap. In the absence of ergonomic chairs or adjustable tables, she sat on low, backless stools. To see her work, she had to bring her face close to the fabric. Over time, the spine would collapse into a permanent hunch known as the seamstress's bow. This was not just an aesthetic issue. It compressed the lungs, making them more susceptible to respiratory diseases. In the poorly ventilated workshops where the air was thick with the dust of wool and linen fibers, a chronic cough was the standard accompaniment to the sound of the needle. But perhaps the most cruel of all the tools was the light, or rather the lack of it. In an age before electricity, the working day was dictated by the sun. But the demand for luxury goods did not stop when the sun went down. To meet their quotas, women worked by the light of tallow candles or small oil lamps. Tallow made from animal fat produced a dim, flickering yellow light and a thick, acrid smoke that stung the eyes and blackened the lungs. This constant flickering forced the eye muscles to work in overdrive. By her late 20s, a professional seamstress would often find the world becoming a blur. The fine details she had once mastered became impossible to see. This was the ultimate tragedy for a woman whose entire value was tied to her precision. When her eyes failed, she was cast aside. The chemicals used in the fabrics were another hidden instrument of torture. Medieval dyes were not the safe synthetic pigments we use today. They were derived from minerals, plants, and sometimes dangerous heavy metals. Greens were often made with malachite or verdigris, which contain copper. Red dyes could involve lead or mercury. As the seamstress handled the fabric, the dust of these dyes would coat her skin and be inhaled into her lungs. Chronic lead poisoning was an occupational hazard leading to tremors, joint pain, and mental decline. The very colors that made the nobility look so vibrant were slowly poisoning the women who handled them. We must also consider the shears. Medieval shears were heavy, forged from iron, and operated with a spring mechanism that required significant hand strength to close. For a woman performing hundreds of cuts a day, this led to a condition we would now recognize as carpal tunnel syndrome or severe tendinitis. Her wrists would swell, her hands would go numb, and the simple act of gripping a tool would become an exercise in agony. Yet she could not stop. To stop was to lose her place in the workshop. To stop was to let her children go hungry. Consider the archaeological evidence found in a 14th century cemetery in East London. Researchers discovered the remains of several women whose skeletons told a story of professional labor that the history books had ignored. Their teeth showed deep grooves from biting through thread, a common practice that saved time but destroyed the enamel and led to chronic dental abscesses. Their right shoulder blades were significantly larger than their left, a physical adaptation to the repetitive motion of pulling a needle through heavy fabric. These were not just women. These were specialized biological machines. This physical toll was exacerbated by the legal pressures of the time. When a new sumptuary law was passed and the nobility scrambled to have their wardrobes updated to meet the new standards, the pressure on the workshops reached a fever pitch. A seamstress might not leave her stool for days at a time, sleeping in short bursts with her head on the table. The lack of movement led to circulatory issues and swelling of the legs, a condition they called the weaver's dropsy. The urgency of the nobility's fashion was a direct cause of the seamstress's physical collapse. The tools were also symbols of her legal status. In some jurisdictions, if a woman was found sewing without a license, her shears could be broken in front of her, a symbolic act of professional execution. Her tools were her identity. To lose them was to lose her voice in the world. This is why she cared for them with such intensity, why she polished the rusted iron and sharpened the dull bone. They were her lifeline and her tormentor all at once. As we conclude this examination of the physical reality of the craft, we must realize that the medieval seamstresses did not see themselves as victims. They saw themselves as professionals. The pain was the price of admission to a world where they had a skill that no one else could replicate. They bore the marks of their trade with a grim pride, knowing that the queens and duchesses who wore their work could never survive a single day in the workshop. Their bent backs were the foundations of empires of style, and their scarred hands were the true architects of the medieval aesthetic. The needle may have been a tool of torture, but in the hands of these women, it became a scepter of hidden power. Every stitch was a victory over the physical decline that sought to claim her. And every finished garment was a testament to a spirit that refused to be broken, even when the bones were bent. In the next chapter, we will see how these women took this pain and transformed it into a different kind of power. They realized that if their bodies were the price of the nobility's vanity, then that vanity gave them a unique leverage. But for now, we sit with them in the dim light, listening to the rhythmic snip of the heavy shears and the soft sigh of a woman whose back will never be straight again. If a garment could speak, it would not tell the story of the person wearing it, but the secrets of the person who made it. In the medieval world, where the majority of women were denied the right to read or write, the needle became their pen and the fabric their parchment. While the nobles paraded in the sun, unaware of the messages resting against their skin, the seamstresses were weaving a complex language of symbols, rebellion, and protection into the very seams of history. This was the silent dialogue of the oppressed, and in this chapter, we uncover the secrets hidden in the seams. To the untrained eye, a line of decorative embroidery on a sleeve was simply a display of wealth. But to those who knew the code, it could be a signature, a warning, or a prayer. Because they were forbidden from signing their work, many master seamstresses developed a unique stitch, a subtle variation in tension, or a specific way of knotting a thread that served as a digital fingerprint. If you look closely at the surviving textiles of the 14th century, you will sometimes find a single intentional error. A gold thread that skips a beat, a flower with one petal stitched in a slightly different shade of silk. This was not a mistake. It was the mark of a woman asserting her existence in a world that wanted her to be a nameless machine. It was a whisper across time saying, "I was here, and I created this." But the secrets went deeper than mere signatures. The Middle Ages was a world saturated in symbolism and superstition. The lining of a garment, the part that touched the skin, was considered a sacred space. Seamstresses were often asked to sew protective charms into the doublets of knights or the gowns of women in labor. They would hide small pieces of parchment inscribed with holy verses or pagan incantations between the layers of linen. They might sew a dried sprig of rowan for protection against the evil eye, or a tiny pouch of salt to ward off illness. The wearer felt the lump of the charm and felt safe, but only the seamstress knew exactly what was hidden inside. She was not just a maker of clothes, she was a weaver of fate, a domestic magician who provided a layer of spiritual armor to her clients. This hidden layer also served a more dangerous purpose: political subversion. In times of religious upheaval or dynastic war, the seamstress was the ultimate smuggler. A message written on a scrap of silk could be sewn into the padding of a sleeve or the hem of a cloak. Because the guild inspectors were looking for illegal fabrics rather than hidden documents, these messages traveled safely through the most heavily guarded gates. There are legends of women who used the patterns of their embroidery to communicate troop movements or the arrival of secret envoys. A specific arrangement of lilies might mean one thing, while a row of thorns meant another. The fashion of the court was a map that only a few could read, and the women with the needles held the key. Then, there was the secret of the sumptuary laws. As we have discussed, these laws were designed to keep everyone in their social place. But vanity is a powerful force, and the wealthy merchant class was always looking for ways to mimic the nobility. Seamstresses became experts in the art of the hidden luxury. They would create garments that looked plain and modest on the outside to satisfy the law, but were lined with forbidden furs or expensive silks on the inside. A coat might be made of humble gray wool, but when the wearer moved, a flash of forbidden scarlet silk would be visible in the deep folds of the pleats. This was a shared secret between the maker and the wearer, a silent conspiracy against the rigid structures of the state. It was a way for the disenfranchised to taste the forbidden without alerting the authorities. The fitting room was the center of this intelligence network. To a noble woman, the seamstress was often treated as an invisible part of the furniture. They spoke freely of their scandals, their husbands' debts, and their father's political alliances, while the seamstress knelt at their feet pinning a hem. They underestimated the woman with the mouthful of pins, but she was listening. She heard everything. The information gathered in these sessions was more valuable than gold. A seamstress who knew which lord was plotting a rebellion or which lady was carrying an illicit child held a power that could topple families. Sometimes this information was used for blackmail, but more often it was used as currency within the underground sisterhood to protect their own interests or to help a fellow worker in trouble. We must also consider the psychological secrets of the cut. A master seamstress knew how to use fabric to create an illusion of perfection. She knew how to pad a shoulder to hide a deformity, or how to use vertical seams to give a short man the stature of a king. These were the secrets of the body. She saw the nobility in their most vulnerable state, stripped of their finery, standing in their undergarments. She saw the scars of battle, the ravages of age, and the physical marks of excess. In the workshop, the myths of royal blood and divine right evaporated. To the seamstress, the king was just a man with a narrow chest and a difficult waistline. This perspective gave the women a quiet sense of superiority. They were the ones who created the public image of power, but they were the only ones who knew the fragile reality beneath the velvet. In some regions, the secrets were more literal. In the borderlands of war, torn Europe, seamstresses would sometimes sew coins into the heavy hems of their own skirts. This was their emergency fund, their escape plan. If the city was sacked or the workshop burned, they carried their entire wealth on their bodies, hidden in the very stitches they had mastered. The weight of the skirt was the weight of their security. This practice was so common that it eventually influenced the way garments were constructed, with reinforced seams designed specifically to carry the hidden weight of gold. The most poetic secret, however, was the language of the threads themselves. In an era where dyes were expensive and colors had specific meanings, the choice of thread was never accidental. A seamstress might use a blue thread to sew a secret prayer for a sick child into the collar of a father's tunic. She might use a red thread to bind a curse into the garment of a cruel master. Every time she pulled the needle through, she was setting an intention. This was the silent music of the workshop, a symphony of hopes and fears that was stitched into the very fabric of medieval life. As we look at the surviving masterpieces in museums today, we must remember that we are only seeing half the story. We see the surface, the beauty, and the skill, but the true heart of the medieval seamstress is hidden in the parts we cannot see. It is in the reinforced corners that were meant to last a lifetime. It is in the hidden pockets that held forbidden letters. It is in the tiny charms that have long since turned to dust. These women were the silent chroniclers of their age, recording the truth in a medium that was meant to be worn and eventually discarded. The secrets in the seams tell us that these women were not just passive laborers. They were active participants in the drama of their time. They used their craft to protect themselves, to rebel against injustice, and to assert their identity in a world that tried to silence them. They proved that even a single thread can be a lifeline, and even a small needle can be a tool of change. As we move into the next chapter of our story, we will look at how this hidden power was tested when the seamstress stepped out of the shadows and into the dangerous world of noble patronage, where a single mistake could mean the difference between a life of luxury and a trip to the gallows. But for now, let us appreciate the mystery. Let us imagine the thousands of secret prayers and hidden messages that still exist in the world, tucked away in the seams of ancient garments, waiting for someone to listen. The seamstress is long gone, but her voice remains stitched into the fabric of our shared history, a silent witness to the enduring power of the female spirit. In the year 1363, King Edward III of England issued a decree that would change the landscape of fashion forever. He looked out at the growing wealth of the merchant class and saw a threat. Commoners were starting to dress like knights, and the daughters of bakers were appearing in the silks of duchesses. To the medieval mind, this was not just a matter of bad taste, it was a direct assault on the divine order of the world. If a person's status could not be identified at a single glance, the very foundations of society were at risk of crumbling. This was the birth of the Sumptuary laws, a complex web of regulations designed to freeze every human being in their social station. For the medieval seamstress, this was the ultimate trap, a spiderweb of law where the needle was both the bait and the executioner's blade. The sumptuary trap was built on the belief that vanity was a sin and social mobility was a crime. These laws dictated every detail of an individual's wardrobe based on their annual income and their family name. A man earning less than 40 pounds a year was forbidden from wearing any cloth that cost more than 2 shillings per yard. He was barred from wearing fur, specifically ermine or sable, which were reserved for the royalty. His shoes could not have points longer than a few inches, and his wife was forbidden from wearing silk veils or silver gilded belts. On the surface, these laws were aimed at the wearers, but in reality, the primary target of the state's enforcement was the maker. The seamstress was the one who transformed the forbidden fabric into the illegal garment. She was the one who made the rebellion possible. Imagine the tension in a workshop when a wealthy wool merchant's wife arrived with a bolt of forbidden velvet. Velvet was the fabric of kings, deep plush and incredibly expensive. For a merchant's wife to wear, it was a bold act of defiance. The seamstress faced a choice that could define her future. If she accepted the commission, she would be paid more in a week than she usually earned in a month. But if she was caught, the penalties were catastrophic. Under the statutes of many European cities, the artisan who created a prohibited garment was subject to the same fines as the person who wore it. In some cases, the punishment was even more severe. A seamstress could be publicly shamed in the pillory, her illegal work burned before her eyes, or she could be permanently banned from practicing her craft. She was being asked to gamble her life on a client's vanity. This pressure created a new kind of professional expertise, the art of the legal loophole. Seamstresses became legal scholars of fashion. They studied the wording of the royal edicts, looking for gaps they could exploit. If the law forbade a silk gown, perhaps it did not explicitly forbid silk ribbons or silk linings. If the law restricted the length of a train, they would find ways to add volume through clever pleating instead. They developed the technique of the reversible garment. A cloak might be made of humble wool on one side, but lined with expensive prohibited fur on the other. In public, the client appeared to be a law-abiding citizen, but in private, or in the company of friends, the cloak could be turned inside out to reveal their true wealth. The seamstress was no longer just a builder of clothes. She was an architect of deception. But the state had its own architects of enforcement, the dreaded fashion police. In cities like Florence and London, guild inspectors and city officials were empowered to stop citizens on the street and measure their sleeves or the points of their shoes. They would carry small scales to weigh the silver thread in a bodice. They would keep lists of known seamstresses and conduct surprise raids on their homes. These inspectors were not looking for criminals. In the traditional sense, they were looking for signs of excess. A single yard of lace found in a seamstress's basket that she could not account for was enough to trigger a full investigation. The atmosphere of the city became one of constant surveillance, where your neighbors might report the sound of your shears if they suspected you were working on a forbidden velvet doublet. The case of a seamstress in 14th century Venice illustrates the brutality of this trap. She was caught making a set of silk sleeves for the daughter of a local spice merchant. Sleeves were a particular point of contention in medieval law because they were often detachable and used as a display of extreme wealth. The woman was arrested and brought before the city magistrates. Her defense was that she was merely repairing an old garment, but the inspectors pointed to the freshness of the thread and the modern cut of the fabric. She was fined an amount that exceeded the value of her entire workshop. To pay the fine, she had to sell her tools and move her family into a single room in the slums. The sumptuary trap had snapped shut and her career was over. This story was repeated in variations across Europe, serving as a grim warning to any woman who thought she could outsmart the king's law. There was also a deep psychological war at play. The nobility used the seamstress as a gatekeeper. They would often patronize the same underground workshops as the merchants, but they would do so to ensure that their own garments remained superior. A duchess might pay a seamstress to report any merchant's wife who tried to order a similar pattern. The seamstress was forced into a role of double agent caught between the people who gave her the most money and the people who held the most power. She had to navigate the jealousies of her clients, knowing that a single vengeful word from a slighted noblewoman could bring the authorities to her door. In this world, information was as dangerous as a sharp needle. We must also consider the economic impact of these laws. By restricting who could buy luxury goods, the state was trying to control the flow of capital. But the demand for fashion was an unstoppable force. The more the law forbade a certain look, the more desirable it became. This drove the prices of illegal work even higher. The seamstresses who were brave enough, or desperate enough, to continue working in the sumptuary trap became the most highly skilled and highly paid women in the labor market. They were the ones driving innovation in tailoring because they had to be constantly creating new ways to hide wealth or to mimic high fashion using legal materials. They were the ones who invented the art of the trim, where small amounts of expensive fabric were used to give the illusion of a much more expensive garment. The church added another layer of complexity to the trap. Priests would often preach against the evils of vanity, calling the seamstresses the handmaidens of the devil. They argued that by helping people dress above their station, the women were encouraging the sin of pride. In some regions, a woman could be denied communion if she was known to specialize in prohibited garments. This spiritual pressure was a powerful tool of control, especially for women who lived in a society where their soul's salvation was a matter of daily concern. To sew an illegal gown was to risk not just your body in this world, but your soul in the next. As we look back at the sumptuary trap, we see that it was a spectacular failure. People continued to wear what they wanted, and seamstresses continued to make it. The laws were constantly being rewritten because they were impossible to enforce. Every time the king banned a certain style, the seamstresses would find 3 new ways to bypass the ban. This constant tension accelerated the development of the European fashion industry. It forced a level of creativity and technical skill that might never have developed in a free market. The trap was meant to stifle change, but instead, it became a pressure cooker of innovation. The seamstress emerged from this era not as a broken servant, but as a strategic survivor. She had learned how to manage risk, how to negotiate with the powerful, and how to find freedom in the margins of the law. She had proven that the human desire for self-expression through clothing was stronger than the king's desire for control. Every time she pulled a forbidden thread through a piece of silk, she was making a choice for independence. The sumptuary trap remains one of the most fascinating chapters in the history of labor, because it shows how the most marginalized members of society can use their skill to undermine the most powerful institutions. The needle had won. By the end of the 15th century, the sumptuary laws were becoming a relic of the past, unenforceable and ignored. The merchant class had successfully bought their way into the wardrobe of the nobility, and the seamstresses had successfully paved the way for the birth of the professional fashion designer. But the scars of the trap remained. The culture of secrecy, the art of deception, and the fear of the inspector were woven into the DNA of the garment trade. As we move into the next phase of our journey, we will look at how the seamstress managed her most dangerous clients of all, the nobility who could give her everything or take it all away with a single flick of a wrist. To step through the gilded gates of a royal palace was for a seamstress to enter a world where the laws of the street no longer applied and the laws of the whim took their place. If the guild was a wall, the nobility was a labyrinth. Serving the high and mighty of medieval Europe was the ultimate dream for an ambitious artisan, promising a life far removed from the damp cellars of the slums, but it was a dream that frequently turned into a nightmare. In the court of a queen or a duchess, the needle was not just a tool for creation, it was a political instrument, and every garment was a gamble. This was the deadly game of noble patronage. The paradox of the royal seamstress was her position as the most intimate of servants and the most invisible of ghosts. She was the one who saw the queen before the world did. She saw the pale skin, the trembling hands, and the physical flaws that the heavy brocade was designed to mask. This intimacy was a source of immense power, but it was also a source of extreme vulnerability. In a world where a queen's reputation was her only currency, the woman who knew the secrets of her body was a liability. A seamstress who knew too much about a royal pregnancy or a hidden scar could find herself silenced as quickly as she had been summoned. To be favored by the crown was to live in the shadow of the scaffold. Consider the sheer scale of the demands placed upon these women. A royal wedding or a coronation was not just a celebration, it was an industrial undertaking. For the marriage of Margaret of York to Charles the Bold, the sheer volume of fabric required was enough to bankrupt a small city. Hundreds of seamstresses were pressed into service working day and night in a frantic race against the clock. They worked in the drafty corridors of the palace, their fingers numb with cold sewing, thousands upon thousands of tiny freshwater pearls onto heavy velvet bodices. If the light failed, they were expected to continue by the heat of a single torch. If they collapsed from exhaustion, they were replaced. The majesty of the event was built on a foundation of human misery, and the pressure to be perfect was absolute. A single crooked seam on a royal mantle was not just a flaw, it was an insult to the crown, an act of lèse-majesté that could lead to immediate imprisonment. Then there was the nightmare of the payment. This is a detail often ignored by the history books, but it was the defining reality of the noble seamstress's life. In the medieval mind, to be a noble was to be above the vulgarity of cash. Paying a bill was seen as a common activity. Consequently, many of the most famous figures in history died owing thousands of pounds to their tailors and seamstresses. A woman could spend 6 months creating a wardrobe for a duchess, using her own money to buy the silk and the gold thread, only to be told that her payment would be the honor of the service. She was trapped. She could not sue a noble in the courts, and if she refused to do more work, she would be blacklisted from every other noble house in the kingdom. Many of the most talented women of the era lived in a state of gilded poverty, dressed in the scraps of the royalty, but unable to buy a loaf of bread. The case of the seamstresses in the court of Isabella of France illustrates the danger of political shifts. When a queen fell from grace, her entire household fell with her. The women who had spent years crafting her image were suddenly seen as accomplices in her vanity or her perceived crimes. Their workshops were raided, their accounts were seized, and they were often forced to flee the city with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The loyalty they had shown to their patron was rewarded with exile. The fashion of the court was a reflection of its power, and when that power shifted, the fabric of the seamstresses, life was ripped apart, along with the political alliances of the day. We must also look at the psychological warfare within the palace walls. The seamstress was often used as a pawn in the rivalries between different noble factions. A lady-in-waiting might bribe a seamstress to deliberately delay a rival's gown, or to leak the details of her coronation outfit so it could be copied or undermined. The sewing room became a center of espionage. The women with the needles were the ears of the palace hearing the whispered plots and the scandalous rumors that were traded over the sound of the scissors. They had to be master diplomats, knowing when to speak, and more importantly, when to be silent. A single misplaced word could trigger a feud that would last for generations, and the seamstress would be the first one to be sacrificed to save a noble's face. The technical challenges were equally daunting. Medieval fashion was becoming increasingly structured and complex. The invention of the set-in sleeve and the tailored bodice meant that the fit had to be perfect to the millimeter. But noble bodies were not static. They grew, they aged, they changed with the cycles of life. The seamstress had to be a master of the invisible adjustment. She had to know how to alter a gown without leaving a trace of the change. She had to create garments that were both rigid armors of status and flexible coverings for a living human. This required a level of mathematical precision and spatial reasoning that was truly ahead of its time. There was also the danger of the materials themselves. As we have seen, the dyes and the dust of the fine fabrics were toxic, but in the palace, the danger was even more direct. Many fabrics were treated with arsenic to give them a vibrant green color, or with lead to make them heavy and drape beautifully. The seamstress who spent months leaning over these fabrics was inhaling a slow death. Her eyes would turn red, her skin would erupt in sores, and her hair would fall out. To the noble who wore the gown for a few hours, it was a triumph of style. To the woman who made it, it was a slow poison. This was the true cost of the queen's favor, a slow decay of the body in exchange for a place in the marble halls. The competition among seamstresses for noble patronage was fierce. It was a cutthroat world where a woman's reputation could be destroyed by a single rumor of a sloppy stitch. This kept the artisans in a state of perpetual fear. They could never be satisfied with their work because the standards were constantly being raised. Every new arrival from the fashion centers of Milan or Paris brought new techniques and new expectations. The seamstress had to be a lifelong student, constantly reinventing her craft to stay relevant. If she fell behind for a single season, she would be discarded for a younger, more innovative rival. But despite the danger and the debt, there was a reason these women stayed in the game. To be a royal seamstress was to have access to the finest materials the world had to offer. It was to handle silks from the Silk Road and furs from the frozen north. It was to see your work on the most powerful people in the world. For an artist, it was the ultimate stage. There was a profound pride in seeing a king walk into a cathedral wearing a mantle that you had spent 3,000 hours embroidering. Even if he hadn't paid you, even if you were dying of lead poisoning, you were the one who had made him look like a god. You were the one who had translated the idea of power into the reality of cloth. As this chapter of the seamstress's life unfolded, she realized that the palace was not a refuge, but a battlefield. She had moved from the struggle for basic survival in the streets to a struggle for status and legacy in the court. Every stitch was a move in a high-stakes chess game. She was no longer just a worker. She was a courtier of the needle. In the next part of our story, we will see how these women used the resources they gathered in the palace to survive the greatest catastrophe of the medieval world, the Black Death. We will look at how the economy of fashion changed when half of Europe lay dead and the survivors demanded a new kind of beauty. But for now, we leave the palace as the candles are snuffed out. The queen is asleep in her velvet bed, and the seamstress is still awake in the small room beneath the eaves, her eyes burning and her back aching, finishing the lace for the morning's mass. She knows that tomorrow could bring a gold coin or a warrant for her arrest. She knows that her life depends on the strength of a single thread. And yet she continues to sew, because in a world of chaos, the needle is the only thing she can truly control. This is the deadly game, and she is determined to play it until the very end. In the year 1348, the world stopped breathing. The Black Death did not care about the quality of a man's wool or the intricacy of a woman's embroidery. It swept through the narrow alleys of London and the grand plazas of Florence with an equal and terrifying indifference. Within months, the workshops that had been hives of activity became tomb-like spaces of silence. The heavy shears sat rusting on the tables, and the needles lay abandoned in half-finished bodices. For a moment, it seemed that fashion itself had died along with the millions who wore it. But as the bells for the dead finally grew quiet, a new and strange world began to emerge from the ashes. For the surviving seamstresses, the apocalypse was not an end, but a brutal and bloody beginning. The first and most immediate demand on the needle was the business of mourning. In a world where half the population has vanished, everyone is in a state of grief. But in the medieval mind, grief was a public performance. The nobility and the growing merchant class required vast quantities of black cloth. Mourning veils, cloaks, and tunics had to be produced at a speed the world had never seen. The seamstresses who had survived the plague found themselves working in a feverish haze. They were sewing shrouds one hour and mourning gowns the next. This constant contact with death changed the psychology of the workshop. When life is so fragile, the desire to mark one's presence in the world becomes an obsession. As the plague receded, it left behind a shattered economy, but a transformed social structure. Because so many had died, the value of labor skyrocketed. The survivors found themselves with more money than they had ever dreamed of through inheritance and higher wages. For the first time in history, a common laborer could afford a piece of fine cloth. This triggered a massive explosion in demand for tailored clothing. People wanted to live for the moment. There was a collective sense of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. This translated into a frantic desire for the most extreme, the most colorful, and the most expensive fashions imaginable. The seamstress was no longer just a servant. She was the architect of this new defiant identity. The labor shortage hit the guilds with devastating force. So many master tailors had died that the strict monopolies began to crumble. The surviving seamstresses realized they held the power. If a guild inspector tried to harass an independent woman for sewing illegal sleeves, she could simply move to the next parish where the demand was so high that no one cared about the rules. The women began to charge higher prices and negotiate better terms. They were the ones who knew the secrets of the cut, and in a world where workers were scarce, their skill was a commodity that the state could no longer control. This was a silent economic revolution, stitched in the shadows of the plague. The fashion that emerged in the wake of the Black Death was a radical departure from everything that had come before. Before the plague, clothing was loose and draped, designed to hide the body. After the plague, clothing became a second skin. This was the era of the coat-hardy, a tightly fitted garment that followed every curve of the torso. For women, this meant the introduction of low necklines and tight lacing. For men, it meant short doublets and hose that shocked the older generation. To create these garments required a level of tailoring precision that moved beyond the simple seams of the past. The seamstress had to master the art of the curve. She had to understand how to use buttons, a relatively new invention, to pull the fabric tight against the flesh. Buttons were seen by the church as the devil's contraption because they allowed clothing to be removed so easily and fitted so provocatively. But for the seamstress, the button was a tool of liberation. It allowed her to create silhouettes that were impossible with just needles and thread. The work became more technical, more architectural. She was no longer just joining pieces of cloth, she was sculpting the human form. Every buttonhole she hand-stitched was a testament to the new complexity of her craft. The demand for these fitted garments was so high that workshops had to reinvent their production methods, creating the first glimpses of what we might call a fashion house. The sumptuary laws, which we discussed in previous chapters, became almost impossible to enforce during this period. The sheer volume of new wealth meant that everyone was dressing above their station. A peasant woman, who had survived the plague, might now be wearing a silken girdle inherited from her late mistress. The social boundaries were blurring, and the seamstress was the one facilitating this chaos. She was the one cutting the velvet for the upstart and the gold brocade for the lucky survivor. By helping the lower classes mimic the nobility, she was helping to dismantle the very feudal system that had sought to keep her in her place. The psychological impact of the plague also led to a fascination with the macabre in fashion. Seamstresses were asked to embroider motifs of skeletons or fading flowers into the linings of expensive gowns. This was the memento mori, a reminder of death. It was a way for the survivors to process their trauma. The needle was used to stitch the memory of the lost into the fabric of the living. This period saw some of the most beautiful and haunted textiles in human history, where the height of luxury met the depth of despair. The seamstress was the one who had to translate this complex emotion into a physical object. Economic warfare also played out in the supply of materials. With international trade routes disrupted by the plague, the cost of imported fabrics soared. Seamstresses had to become even more resourceful. They learned to repurpose old garments to mix different types of wool and to use local dyes to imitate the expensive colors of the East. They developed the art of the decorative patch, where a hole in a precious sleeve was turned into an intricate piece of embroidery. This resourcefulness became a hallmark of the professional woman. She was a manager of scarcity in a world of sudden abundance. As the 14th century drew to a close, the landscape of the garment trade had been permanently altered. The seamstresses who had lived through the Black Death were different from those who had come before. They were more independent, more specialized, and more aware of their own economic power. They had seen the world end, and they had realized that as long as there were human beings, there would be a desire to be seen to be beautiful and to be remembered. The needle had proved to be a survival tool more effective than any sword. The Black Death was a tragedy of unimaginable proportions, but for the history of labor, it was a catalyst for change. It broke the back of the old guild monopolies and paved the way for the rise of the individual artisan. The seamstresses of Europe had sown their way through the apocalypse and emerged on the other side as the masters of a new, more vibrant and more dangerous world of fashion. They had learned that in the face of death, the only response is to create something that lasts, to make a mark that cannot be erased. In the next part of our story, we will look at how this new economic power led to a clash between the domestic and the professional lives of these women. We will explore the tension between the role of the wife and the role of the master artisan, and how the seamstress navigated the narrow path between the hearth and the workshop. But for now, we remember the women who sat in the quiet cities of the plague, years their needles moving rhythmically as the world around them fell apart. They were the ones who kept the thread of humanity from breaking. They were the ones who stitched the future together, one painful, precise seam at a time. Every time we put on a fitted garment today, we are wearing the legacy of the plague. We are wearing the technical innovations that were born of a labor shortage and a desire to celebrate the body while it still lived. The seamstresses of the 1400s did not just survive the plague, they conquered it with style. They proved that beauty is a form of resilience and that the needle is a weapon of the spirit. The era of the draped tunic was over, and the era of the tailored individual had begun, and it was the women of the workshop who led the way into the light of the Renaissance. A woman sits by the hearth with a needle in her hand and a child at her knee. In the eyes of the medieval church and the legal courts, this is the natural order of things. She is performing a domestic duty, mending a sleeve or darning a sock to keep her family warm. But look closer at her hands. The way she handles the silk is too precise for a mere amateur. The way she calculates the tension of the thread reveals a mind trained in the rigorous workshops of the city. For thousands of women in the Middle Ages, the home was not a sanctuary from the world of work. It was the front line of a battle for professional identity. This was the complex struggle between the domestic and the professional, where the simple act of sewing became a radical claim to independence. To understand this tension, we must first understand the concept of the femme couverte. Under English common law and similar systems across Europe, a married woman had no legal identity separate from her husband. Her property was his property, her earnings were his earnings, and her very existence was covered by his legal status. For a seamstress, this was a devastating barrier. If she sold a gown, the money belonged to her husband. If she entered into a contract for fabric, it was her husband who was legally responsible. This system was designed to keep women in the domestic sphere, but the reality of the medieval economy forced a quiet revolution. Women began to claim the status of femme sole, a woman alone. This was a legal loophole that allowed a married woman to trade as if she were single. It was the birth of the female entrepreneur, and it started at the kitchen table. The transition from sewing for the family to sewing for the market was a dangerous one. As long as a woman was mending her husband's tunic, she was seen as virtuous. The moment she began to take in work for a neighbor or a local merchant, she became a threat to the male guilds. The men argued that a woman's place was in the home and that her professional labor was a corruption of her natural role. They used the domesticity of the work against the women, claiming that because they worked in their homes, they could not be considered true professionals. This created a profound psychological burden. A seamstress had to be a master of the double life. She had to manage the chaos of a medieval household, the cooking, the cleaning, the childcare, while maintaining the absolute precision required for high fashion. Imagine the daily life of a woman named Alice in 14th century London. Her day does not begin in a workshop, it begins at the hearth. She must prepare the morning meal, tend to the fire, and ensure her children are cared for. But tucked away in the corner of her main room is her work frame. The moment the domestic chores are finished, or even while they are in progress, her needle starts to move. She sews while the bread is rising. She sews while her children sleep. The boundary between her life as a mother and her life as a master artisan is non-existent. This constant switching between roles led to a unique kind of professional exhaustion. She was never truly off duty. The technical demands of a complex bodice required hours of unbroken concentration, but a domestic life is a series of constant interruptions. Every time she had to put down her needle to tend to a crying child, she risked a dropped stitch or a stained fabric. Yet it was this very domesticity that gave the seamstresses their greatest advantage. Because they worked in the home, they had lower overhead costs, than the male tailors, who had to maintain expensive shops in the commercial districts. They could offer their services for a lower price while maintaining a higher quality. They turned the domestic space into a laboratory of efficiency. They involved their daughters and sisters in the work, creating small family cooperatives that were more flexible and resilient than the rigid guild workshops. The home was not a cage. It was a decentralized factory. This economic reality terrified the male establishment because they realized that they could not compete with the hidden labor of the household. The case of the silk women of London is a perfect example of this professional defiance. These were women who specialized in the incredibly delicate work of weaving and embroidering silk ribbons and cords. They were almost entirely independent of the male guilds. They organized their own apprenticeships and managed their own trade networks, all while operating from their domestic spaces. They petitioned the king for protection against foreign imports, arguing that their craft was essential to the wealth of the nation. In their petitions, they did not speak as humble wives, they spoke as skilled artisans and protectors of an industry. They were using the language of the professional world to protect the space of the home. But the struggle was not just legal and economic, it was social. A professional woman was often viewed with suspicion by her neighbors. In a world where a woman's reputation was tied to her modesty, the act of dealing with male merchants and noble clients was seen as a potential moral failing. A seamstress who had men coming to her door for fittings was whispered about at the village well. She had to navigate a minefield of social expectations. To stay successful, she had to be more than just a good sewer. She had to be a master of public relations. She had to maintain a facade of domestic piety while running a cutthroat business. This forced a level of social intelligence that her male counterparts rarely had to develop. The tension between the domestic and the professional was also reflected in the tools and materials. In the domestic world, fabric was a precious resource to be used and reused until it fell apart. In the professional world, fabric was a commodity to be cut and shaped with bold confidence. A seamstress had to bridge these two mindsets. She had to bring the frugality of the housewife to the management of her workshop, while bringing the daring of the artist to her designs. She was the one who knew how to turn a worn-out cloak into a fashionable set of sleeves, or how to use the smallest scraps of silk to create a decorative trim that added gold to the value of a garment. As the Middle Ages progressed, we see a shift in how these women were recorded in history. In the early centuries, they were often listed simply as the wife of a certain man. By the late 15th century, we start to see them listed by their own professional titles. They were recognized as masters in their own right. This was a hard-won victory. It was the result of millions of hours of labor performed in the margins of a domestic life. It was the result of women refusing to accept that their skill was just a hobby or a duty. They had transformed the needle from a symbol of domestic submission into a tool of professional liberation. This chapter of our story reveals the true origin of the modern working woman. She was not born in the offices of the 20th century, but in the kitchens and attics of the 14th. She was the woman who realized that her home could be a power base and that her hands could create a life that was hers alone. The struggle was intense and the cost was high, but the legacy is unmistakable. Every time a woman today manages a career and a family, she is walking the path blazed by the medieval seamstress. As we move into the next part of our journey, we will look at the most sacred and perhaps the most stifling space of all for these women, the church. We will explore the sacred stitch and see how the seamstress served the house of God. Was the church a place of refuge where her skill was celebrated as a divine gift, Or was it just another workshop where her labor was exploited for the glory of men in robes? But for now, we look at the woman by the hearth one last time. The fire is dying, the child is asleep, and she is still sewing. She is no longer just a wife, she is a professional, and the world is starting to take notice. The silence of the home was the sound of a revolution. The rhythmic movement of the needle was the heartbeat of a new economy. The medieval seamstress had proven that the heart of a professional could beat just as strongly in a humble kitchen as it did in a royal court. She had mastered the stitch, and in doing so, she had begun to unpick the very fabric of the society that tried to keep her contained. Beneath the soaring stone arches of a medieval cathedral, where the light filters through stained glass in ribbons of sapphire and ruby, there exists a world of silence. In this space, the clatter of the city fades, and the only sound is the soft rhythmic pull of a silk thread through a heavy frame. While the knights fought for land and the kings fought for crowns, the women of the church were fighting a different kind of battle. They were capturing the divine in the weave of a needle. This was the era of the sacred stitch, a time when embroidery was considered the highest of all arts, and the women who mastered it were the true architects of the spiritual imagination. To understand the power of the sacred stitch, we must look at the phenomenon known as opus Anglicanum, or English work. From the 13th to the mid-14th century, this was the most coveted luxury item in all of Europe. Popes in Rome and kings in Spain sent emissaries across the sea to London with a single mission to bring back a piece of this miraculous needlework. What made it so special was not just the material, but the soul infused into the silk. These were not mere decorations, they were windows into heaven. A single cope, a semicircular cloak worn by a bishop during the most holy of ceremonies, could take a team of professional embroideresses over 5 years of constant labor to complete. Every square inch was covered in thousands of microscopic stitches depicting scenes from the Bible with a realism that rivaled the finest paintings of the age. The atmosphere of the sacred workshop was unlike any other. Whether in the quiet cell of a convent or the high-end professional studios of London, the work was treated as a form of liturgy. In the convents, the nuns viewed their needlework as a path to salvation. Every stitch was a prayer. Every knot was a vow of devotion. They worked in a state of meditative silence, believing that any stray thought or idle word would stain the purity of the garment. This spiritual focus led to a level of technical perfection that is almost incomprehensible to the modern mind. They used split stitches so fine that they looked like brush strokes, and they pioneered the technique of underside couching, which allowed them to secure heavy gold threads with invisible silk, so the garment remained as flexible as water, despite being made of precious metal. But we must not fall into the trap of thinking this was purely a world of pious amateurs. The demand for sacred textiles was so immense that the church had to rely on professional women. These were master artisans who lived in the city and managed their own workshops. In the records of the great wardrobe of King Edward III, we find the names of women like Mabel of Bury St. Edmunds. Mabel was a superstar of the medieval world. She was commissioned by the king to create a set of vestments that would be gifted to the Pope himself. She was not a nun. She was a businesswoman and a high-level technician who commanded enormous fees for her skill. She managed a network of apprentices and journeywomen specialized in different techniques, from goldwork to the shading of silk. Her work was the face of English prestige on the global stage. The materials used in the sacred stitch were the most expensive substances on earth. The gold thread was not just a color. It was a thin strip of silver dipped in real gold and wrapped around a core of silk or linen. The pearls were harvested from the depths of the sea, and the jewels were brought from the ends of the Silk Road. For a seamstress, handling these materials was a terrifying responsibility. To lose a single pearl or to snag a piece of gold brocade was a catastrophe that could lead to financial ruin or a sentence of public penance. The pressure to be perfect for the glory of God was even more intense than the pressure to be perfect for the vanity of a queen. If a royal gown was a statement of power, a church vestment was a statement of eternity. The physical toll of this holy labor was profound. Because the work was so delicate and the materials so reflective, the strain on the eyes was devastating. The shimmer of the gold thread under the flicker of a candle was like staring into a miniature sun. Many of the most talented embroideresses went blind before middle age. They literally gave their sight to the images of the saints they created. There is a deep irony in this. The women who created the visual identity of the church were often the ones who could no longer see the beauty they had made. Their hands moved by memory and touch, alone their fingers, so attuned to the texture of the silk that they could feel a flaw that no eye could perceive. But the church was also a place of contradiction for these women. On one hand, it celebrated their skill as a divine gift. On the other, it preached against the very luxury they were hired to create. A priest might stand at a pulpit, wearing a robe worth more than an entire village, while simultaneously condemning the women of his congregation for wearing silk veils. This hypocrisy was not lost on the seamstresses. They saw the underside of the church's majesty. They knew that the bishop's humility was a performance staged with the help of 10,000 hours of their labor. This gave them a cynical and grounded perspective on the institutions of power. They were the ones who saw that even the most sacred of men needed a well-stitched hem to look the part. Despite this, the sacred stitch provided women with a rare form of social and intellectual freedom. In the convents, women were encouraged to study the complex iconography of the Bible so they could accurately depict the stories in their embroidery. This allowed them to engage with theology and art in a way that was forbidden to their secular sisters. The needle became a tool of learning. The intricate patterns were not just decorative, they were narrative puzzles that required a deep understanding of geometry and storytelling. A master embroideress was a scholar of the silk. She was the one who decided how the light would fall on the face of a martyr, or how the wings of an angel would arch across a shoulder. In these creative choices, she exercised a quiet but profound authority. The legacy of the Opus Anglicanum is still with us today, tucked away in the temperature-controlled vaults of museums like the Victoria and Albert in London. When you look at the Syon Cope or the Steeple Aston Cope, you are looking at the survivors of a vanished world. You are looking at the breath and the pulse of thousands of anonymous women. Most of their names were never written down. They were lost to history as soon as they laid down their needles, but their presence is undeniable in the shimmer of the gold and the tension of the silk. They proved that labor could be a form of transcendence. This chapter of the seamstress's life shows us that she was the keeper of the sacred flame. She was the one who translated the abstract concepts of faith into the physical reality of beauty. Without her, the cathedrals would have been cold and gray. Without her, the ceremonies of the church would have lacked the majesty that drew the faithful into the fold. She was the architect of the divine atmosphere. But as we move into the later Middle Ages, the winds of change were starting to blow. The rise of the merchant class and the bickering of the Reformation would soon threaten the monopoly of the sacred stitch. Fashion was about to become a weapon of rebellion. In the next part of our story, We will look at how the skill of the needle moved from the altar to the street. We will explore how clothing became a tool of social subversion, where the way you wore your hair, or the length of your sleeves, was a declaration of war against the status quo. The seamstress was about to become a revolutionary, but for now, we leave her in the quiet of the cloister, her needle rising and falling in the candlelight. She is sewing a vision of paradise, and for a brief moment in the silence of the stitch, she is already there. The sacred stitch reminds us that even in a world of rigid hierarchy, there are spaces where beauty and skill create their own truth. The women of the needle may have been silenced by the laws of men, but they spoke in a language of gold and silk that the world would never forget. Every stitch was a defiance of mortality, a claim to a place in the eternal order. And as the last candle is snuffed out in the cathedral, the gold thread continues to glow in the dark, a silent testament to the enduring power of the woman who held the needle. Chao Chi Im Tiep Tuk Tuk Hien. Fun 12. Fashion as Rebellion. Trong Chuong Nai. Chung Taset Hei Su Chuyen Min Jai. Man me kuat hoi trang tu kong ku abjatra tu sang kong ku pa bok xieng si shiksha hoi. Kikak kuita kutan vo. Nhung ngwoi punu vokai. Kim trong tai jang yup kamot the hi no ai lon. Bang vengwai kuamin. Sotu muktia. 1502. Kich ban chitiet. Ngon ngu. US/UK English. Style instructions: energetic, provocative, and revolutionary. The voice should carry a sense of defiance and bold confidence. Use sharp, punchy descriptions to highlight the outrageous fashions of the time and the seamstress's role as the architect of this social upheaval. Full script, AI voice ready. A dress is not just a collection of seams and fabric, it can be a riot. It can be a declaration of war against a world that demands you stay in your place. As the late Middle Ages roared toward the Renaissance, the silent obedience of the past began to fray at the edges. The social order that had stood for centuries, where everyone knew their rank by the color of their cloak, was being dismantled by a new generation of rebels. And at the heart of this revolution was the seamstress. She was no longer just a servant. She was an agent of subversion, providing the marginalized and the ambitious with the visual weapons they needed to challenge the status quo. This was the era of fashion as rebellion, and the needle was the sharpest point of the attack. The rebellion began with the silhouette. For generations, the human form had been obscured by heavy drapes and loose tunics. But now, people wanted to be seen. They wanted to take up space. This led to the creation of some of the most outrageous and impractical fashions in history. Consider the poulain, the shoe with a point so long it had to be tied to the knee with gold chains. To the church, this was a phallic absurdity, but to the young men of the merchant class, it was a giant middle finger to the sumptuary laws. The seamstress had to figure out how to stiffen these points using whalebone or moss, making sure they stayed upright while the wearer strutted through the muddy streets of London or Paris. Every inch of that shoe was a challenge to the authority of the guilds. For women, the rebellion took place on their heads. The hennin, the towering conical hat that could reach 3 feet in height, was a masterpiece of architectural engineering and social defiance. It required a complex internal structure of wire and starched linen, which the seamstress had to balance perfectly so it wouldn't topple over. These hats were so tall that the nobility had to duck under doorways, and the church compared them to the horns of the devil. But for the women who wore them, they were a way of reclaiming their stature. They were saying, "I am here, I am powerful, and I refuse to be diminished. The seamstress who mastered the hennin was not just making a hat, she was helping her clients conquer the room. But the most dangerous rebellion was the blurring of gender lines. In the late 14th century, we start to see women adopting elements of masculine dress. They began to wear tightly fitted doublets with rows of buttons and padded shoulders, styles that were strictly reserved for men. This was a direct assault on the gender hierarchy of the time. The seamstress was the one who translated these masculine cuts into the female form, making them both provocative and powerful. When a woman stepped out in a tailored bodice that mimicked a knight's armor, she was not just being fashionable, she was asserting a level of autonomy that terrified the male establishment. She was proving that identity was something that could be constructed and changed with the help of a skilled artisan. The rebellion also moved into the realm of the forbidden neckline. As the medieval era progressed, bodices became lower and tighter, revealing more skin than the church had ever permitted. The seamstress developed the art of the secret support, using stiffened canvas and early forms of boning to lift and shape the body. This was not just about vanity, it was about the ownership of the body. In a society where a woman's body was considered the property of her father or her husband, the act of displaying it on her own terms was a radical move. The seamstress became a co-conspirator in this physical liberation, helping women navigate the line between the acceptable and the scandalous. We must also look at the rebellion of the commoners. As we have seen, the merchant class was gaining wealth, and they used that wealth to mimic the nobility. But they didn't just stop at copying, they started to innovate. They took the styles of the court and made them louder, more colorful, and more exaggerated. The seamstress was the one who facilitated this social climbing. She would take a noble design and tweak it, adding more lace, more embroidery, and more gold than the law allowed for a merchant. She was helping her clients buy their way into a social status they hadn't been born into. Every time a baker's daughter appeared in a silken girdle, the feudal system died a little more. This period of rebellion led to a culture of constant change. Fashion, which had once moved at the pace of centuries, began to move at the pace of seasons. The demand for the new and the different was insatiable. This was the birth of the fashion victim, but it was also the birth of the fashion icon. People like the Duchess of Burgundy became celebrities known for their daring and expensive tastes. The seamstress had to be a trend forecaster, anticipating the next move in the social war. She had to be faster than the law and more creative than her rivals. This pressure pushed the technical limits of tailoring to their breaking point. But there was a dark side to this rebellion. The state and the church fought back with a ferocity that was often terrifying. We find records of women being dragged into the street and having their veils torn off or their shoes cut in half by angry mobs. The seamstress who created these rebellious looks was often the first one to be blamed for the moral decay of the city. She lived in a state of constant social friction. She was celebrated by her clients, but despised by the authorities. Her workshop was a site of both immense creativity and immense risk. To be a revolutionary of the needle was to live with one eye on the fabric and one eye on the gallows. Consider the case of the short doublets for men. These were so short that they revealed the hose and the codpiece in a way that the older generation found obscene. In some cities, laws were passed that allowed any citizen to stop a young man and measure his doublet. If it was too short, he was fined, and the tailor who made it was banned from the city. Yet despite the fines and the shaming, the style only became more popular. The rebellion was unstoppable. The seamstress realized that the law could regulate the fabric, but it could never regulate the human desire for self-expression. The more the authorities tried to stop the fashion, the more it became a symbol of freedom. The rebellion of the needle was also a rebellion of the intellect. As the seamstress moved away from the traditional patterns of the past, she had to engage in complex spatial reasoning. She was reinventing the way fabric interacted with the human body. She was creating new ways of draping, fitting, and constructing. This was a period of intense experimentation. The workshop became a laboratory of style where the only limit was the imagination of the maker and the daring of the wearer. This intellectual freedom was a form of rebellion in itself, in a world that told women their only role was to follow the rules. As we look at the legacy of this period, we see that the seamstresses were the ones who paved the way for the modern world. They proved that clothing is more than just protection. It is a language of identity and a tool of social change. They showed that by changing the way we look, we can change the way the world sees us. The rebellion of the late Middle Ages was the first step toward the individualistic culture we live in today. It was the moment when the needle proved to be more powerful than the sword in the fight for social mobility. In the next part of our story, we will look at how this rebellion led to the ultimate clash, the courtroom records. We will explore the historical cases where women fought for their right to work and their right to their professional identity in the halls of justice. The battle for the needle was moving from the streets to the courts, and the stakes had never been higher. But for now, we remember the seamstress in the heat of the revolution. Her shears are moving fast, her mind is racing, and she is creating the look that will topple an empire of tradition. The riot in the fabric was a riot in the heart. Every illegal stitch, every exaggerated silhouette, and every daring neckline was a step toward a world where we can be whoever we want to be. The medieval seamstress was the architect of our freedom, and her story is written in the seams of our own rebellion. As the sun sets on the medieval world and the light of the Renaissance begins to shine, we see that the needle is still moving, still creating, still rebelling against the shadows of the past. The sound of a heavy wooden gavel striking a stone table echoes through the halls of justice. But for the woman standing in the center of the room, the sound is a heartbeat of fear and defiance. This is not a trial for theft or murder, though the consequences for her life may be just as final. She is here because she dared to own her skill. In the archives of the Middle Ages, hidden among the dry records of property disputes and tax assessments, lie the voices of women who took their battle for the needle to the highest courts in the land. These are the courtroom records, the paper trail of a revolution, where the ink was as vital as the thread. In this chapter, we witness the moment when the seamstress stopped hiding in the shadows and demanded her day in court. To understand the legal battlefield, we must look at the nature of the medieval court itself. It was a space designed by men for men. The judges, the lawyers, and the guildmasters who brought the charges were all part of a brotherhood that viewed a professional woman as a legal impossibility. When a seamstress was summoned to court, she was often entering a trap where the laws were written to ensure her failure. The most common charge was infringing on the monopoly of the Tailors' Guild. The guilds argued that by cutting fabric or training, apprentices women were stealing the bread from the mouths of honest men. They used the language of protectionism, claiming that female labor was of inferior quality and would bring shame to the city's reputation. But as the records show, the truth was far more complex. One of the most famous legal battles occurred in late 17th century Paris, but its roots were firmly planted in the medieval struggle. The seamstresses of Paris collectively sued for the right to form their own officially recognized guild. They argued that they had been practicing their craft since time immemorial, and that the male tailors had no right to harass them in their homes. In the courtroom, they presented garments of such incredible complexity that the judges could not deny their skill. They argued that there were certain tasks, specifically the fitting of women's bodices, that required a female touch for the sake of decency and precision. This was a strategic use of the era's morality to carve out a legal professional space. They were using the church's own rules on modesty to defeat the men's rules on money. The records also reveal the individual tragedies of the law. Consider the case of a widow in 14th century London named Julian, who was sued by the Merchant Tailors Company. The guild claimed she was taking on more work than her late husband's license allowed. In the transcript, we hear her voice filtered through the dry language of the clerk. She speaks of her 6 children, of the debt her husband left behind, and of the 20 years she spent perfecting her craft by his side. She argues that her hands are the same hands that produced the guild's own masterpieces. The court's decision was brutal. She was ordered to stop working, and her tools were seized. But by standing her ground and having her testimony recorded, Julian ensured that her struggle was not forgotten. She became a legal precedent, a thorn in the side of the guild's absolute power. The defense strategies used by these women were brilliant in their simplicity. Many argued the concept of necessity. In a world with high mortality rates and frequent wars, the city was full of widows and orphans. The women argued that if they were forbidden from sewing, they would become a burden on the parish or be forced into a life of crime. They presented themselves not as rebels, but as responsible citizens trying to maintain the social order. This economic argument often carried weight with city magistrates, who were more concerned with the cost of poverty than with the purity of the guild's monopoly. The seamstresses were essentially telling the court, if you stop us from working, you will have to pay to feed us. It was a cold, calculated, and highly effective form of legal leverage. We also find records of women suing each other or suing their male subcontractors. These documents prove that the medieval garment trade was a complex ecosystem of business relationships. There are cases of seamstresses suing for unpaid debts or for the return of stolen patterns. This proves that they viewed themselves as business owners with rights that they were willing to defend. They understood the power of the written contract. They would bring witnesses to court, neighbors, other seamstresses, even noble clients, to testify to the validity of their claims. The courtroom was a stage where they performed their professional identity, showing the world that they were not just domestic servants, but participants in a global market. The role of the witness was crucial. In a society where a woman's word was often valued less than a man's, the seamstresses built networks of support. A noblewoman might send a letter to the court, testifying to the skill and character of her seamstress, effectively using her high social status to shield the artisan from the guild's harassment. These letters are rare, but they provide a glimpse into the cross-class alliances that kept the underground economy breathing. The guild might have the law, but the seamstress had the patronage of the powerful, and in the medieval world, power often trumped the law. The legal records also track the evolution of the term seamstress itself. Early documents use vague terms like needlewoman or simply female worker. But as the legal battles progressed, the language became more specific. We see the emergence of the title mistress seamstress in the court records of the 15th century. This was a significant victory. It was a formal recognition of their status as masters of their craft. To have that title written in the ink of a court clerk was to have a permanent place in the professional history of the city. It was a sign that the invisible ceiling was beginning to crack under the weight of their persistence. However, the cost of these legal battles was immense. Many women spent their life savings on lawyers and court fees, only to lose their case in the end. The stress of constant litigation led to the collapse of many workshops. The guild's strategy was often one of attrition. They knew they couldn't stop every woman, but they could make the cost of working so high that most would give up. This created a legal survival of the fittest. Only the most organized, the most connected, and the most resilient women survived the courtroom records. These survivors were the ones who would go on to form the first female guilds and professional associations in the following centuries. Archaeologists and historians today treat these courtroom records as a treasure map. By following the names in the transcripts, they can reconstruct the geography of the medieval fashion world. They can see which streets were home to the secret workshops and which families controlled the trade in forbidden fabrics. The court records provide a level of detail that the vanity of the nobility could never provide. They give us the prices of the thread, the names of the apprentices, and the exact measurements of the seized garments. They are the most honest record of the craft because they were written under the pressure of the law. As we look at the final gavel strike of this chapter, we must realize that the seamstresses did not win a single dramatic victory. Instead, they won 1,000 small battles in 1,000 different courtrooms. Every time a judge ruled in favor of a woman's right to support her children, every time a guild's fine was reduced, and every time a woman's professional title was recorded in the archives, the needle gained a little more ground. The law was a cage, but the seamstresses learned how to pick the lock with their needles. This chapter of history proves that the fight for professional identity is never just about the work itself. It is about the right to be recognized as a participant in society. The medieval seamstress knew that if she didn't fight in the courts, she would eventually be erased from history. By demanding her day in the light of the courtroom, she ensured that her voice would echo across the centuries. She was a master of the stitch, but she was also a master of the law. In the next part of our story, we will move toward the end of the medieval era and the birth of the machine. We will look at the industrial shadow and how the invention of early knitting frames and the precursor to the sewing machine threatened to turn the master artisan into a factory hand. The battle was shifting from the court to the factory floor, and the seamstress was facing her greatest challenge yet. But for now, we leave her in the courtroom, her head held high as the clerk finishes writing her name. She has been heard, and in the eyes of the law, she finally exists. The ink on the parchment has long since dried, but the message remains clear. Skill is a form of property, and identity is a right that must be fought for. The medieval seamstress proved that the needle could be as powerful as the pen, and that even in a world of silence, a woman with a just cause and a sharp mind can make the whole world listen. The courtroom records are not just a list of names, they are a monument to the endurance of the female spirit. For centuries, the rhythm of the garment world was the heartbeat of a human being. It was the steady breath of a woman, the soft rustle of silk, and the quiet snip of shears. But as the 15th century began to bleed into the 16th, a new and terrifying sound began to echo through the streets of Europe. It was the cold metallic click of gears and the relentless groan of wood and iron. The age of the artisan was facing its greatest shadow, not from a rival guild or a royal decree, but from the birth of the machine. The industrial shadow was lengthening, and for the first time in history, the needle found itself in a race it could not win. The first true herald of this change was a machine designed to replace the most basic of human skills, knitting. In 1589, an English clergyman named William Lee invented the stocking frame. He watched his wife knitting by hand hour after hour, and he sought to automate the process. His machine could create stitches at a speed that a dozen women could not match. When he presented his invention to Queen Elizabeth I, she refused to grant him a patent. She looked at the machine and saw not progress, but disaster. She feared for the millions of poor women whose only livelihood was the needle. If a machine could knit a stocking, what would happen to the fingers that had done it for generations? This was a rare moment where the crown and the worker shared the same fear of a future that felt cold and mechanical. But the momentum of technology could not be stopped by royal fear. Even without a patent, the ideas behind the stocking frame began to spread. The mindset of the workshop was shifting from quality and soul to speed and volume. The merchants who had once prized the unique signature of a master seamstress were now looking at the bottom line. They realized that a machine could produce 1,000 identical items, while a woman could only produce one masterpiece. The concept of the standardized garment was born, and with it, the master artisan began to fade into a factory hand. The individuality that the seamstresses had fought so hard to protect in the courtrooms was being erased by the uniformity of the frame. This shift created a profound sense of loss in the workshops. A seamstress who had spent a decade mastering the nuances of fabric found herself being asked to compete with a device that did not feel the silk. The machine did not know how to adjust for the grain of the wool or how to hide a flaw in the weave. It simply repeated the same motion over and over with a soulless precision. This led to a crisis of identity. If the machine could do the work, was the worker still an artist? The spiritual connection of the sacred stitch and the rebellious energy of the fashion riot were being replaced by the mechanical grind of the industrial age. The needle was becoming an attachment to a gear rather than an extension of a human hand. The economic pressure was immediate and brutal. As early mass production began to drive down prices, the wages of the independent seamstresses plummeted. To survive, they had to work even longer hours. The workshops became more crowded, more frantic, and more dangerous. This was the precursor to the sweatshop. The intimacy of the domestic workspace was being replaced by the anonymity of the production line. Women who had once been entrepreneurs and masters were now being treated as interchangeable parts of a larger machine. The industrial shadow was not just taking their work, it was taking their dignity. In response to this, many women turned to sabotage. The word itself comes from the practice of throwing a wooden shoe or sabot into the gears of a machine to stop its progress. There are records of secret groups of knitters and seamstresses who would gather at night to break into factories and destroy the new frames. This was not just an act of mindless violence, it was a desperate defense of a way of life. They were fighting for the right to remain human in a world that was becoming mechanical. They believed that a garment made by a machine lacked the protection and the intention of a hand-stitched piece. They were the last defenders of the soul in the fabric. But the machines were only the beginning. The industrial shadow also brought a new kind of social organization. The city became a grid of factories, and the life of the worker was dictated by the whistle and the clock rather than the sun and the season. The seamstress found herself part of a massive disenfranchised labor force. The cross-class alliances she had built in the palace were being replaced by the class warfare of the industrial city. The noble patron was becoming the factory owner, and the relationship was no longer one of artistic collaboration, but of cold exploitation. The secrets in the seams were being replaced by the statistics of the ledger. Yet even in the shadow of the machine, the spirit of the needle persisted. The master artisans realized that while the machine could do the simple work, it could never do the complex work. They moved even deeper into the world of high fashion and bespoke tailoring. They doubled down on the intricacy of their embroidery and the perfection of their fit. They made their work so difficult that no machine of the time could replicate it. They turned luxury into a fortress of human skill. This was the birth of haute couture, a high-end industry dedicated to the preservation of the handmade. The seamstress had found a way to survive the machine by becoming even more essential to the elite. The transition was painful, and many thousands of women were left behind. The history of the 19th century is full of the tragic figures of the starving seamstress, a recurring character in the literature of the time. But those who survived the industrial shadow were the ones who realized that technology is a tool, not a master. They began to adopt the machines themselves, using them to perform the tedious tasks while reserving the artistry for their own hands. This hybrid model allowed them to stay competitive in a changing world. They were learning to dance with the gears without losing their own rhythm. As we look at the final years of the medieval garment trade, we see that the industrial shadow was inevitable, but it was not absolute. The machine could imitate the stitch, but it could never imitate the woman who made it. It could not hear the secrets of the court, it could not weave a prayer into a hem, and it could not rebel against the king. The power of the needle was always rooted in the human heart, and that is something no gear can ever replace. The age of the handmaid was ending, but the legacy of the artisan was about to become the most valuable luxury in the world. In the next and final part of our story, we will look at the unbroken thread. We will summarize the journey from the blood on the silk to the shadow of the factory and see how the medieval seamstress continues to influence our world today. We will look at her final legacy and the lessons she left for every woman who has ever picked up a needle. The shadow is long, but the light of her spirit is still burning. We are nearing the end of our journey, but the story of the needle is eternal. The thread that connects us to the distant past is not made of stone or bronze. It is not found in the crumbling ruins of castles or the dry pages of tax records. It is a thread made of silk and sweat, of blood and brilliant ambition. It is the unbroken thread that has passed through the fingers of 1 million anonymous women, traveling from the dim attics of medieval London to the bright lights of a modern runway. As we reach the end of this journey, we realize that the medieval seamstress never truly disappeared. She simply evolved, becoming the invisible architect of the world we inhabit today. Every time we pull on a garment that fits our form, every time we admire a complex piece of embroidery, or feel the weight of a well-draped fabric, we are touching her legacy. We began this story with the blood on the silk, and we end it with the triumph of the spirit. We have seen how the needle was a weapon of survival in a world that tried to starve the independent woman. We watched as she navigated the trap of the sumptuary laws, turning a cage of regulations into a laboratory of style. We followed her into the high-stakes game of the royal court, where she translated the abstract idea of power into the tangible reality of velvet and gold. We saw her stand in the courtroom, her voice small but steady, demanding that her skill be recognized as property. And we saw her face the cold, mechanical shadow of the industrial age, refusing to let the soul of the handmaid be crushed by the gears of progress. What remains of these women today? Most of their names, like Elena from Bruges or Julian from London, are just whispers in the archives. but their presence is everywhere. They were the ones who taught us that identity is something that can be constructed. They proved that a woman's worth is not defined by her domesticity, but by her professional mastery. They were the first true entrepreneurs, the first fashion icons, and the first social rebels. They showed us that even when you are silenced by the law, you can still speak through your work. The secrets they sewed into the seams of the Middle Ages were messages of resilience for all of us. They were telling us that skill is a form of freedom, and that beauty is a form of resistance. The technical innovations of the medieval workshop are the foundations of the global fashion industry. The way we cut a sleeve, the way we reinforce a seam, the way we use buttons to shape a silhouette, all of these were perfected by women who had nothing but a piece of iron and a tallow candle. They were the original engineers of the body. They understood the mathematics of the curve long before the world allowed them to study science. They practiced a form of domestic alchemy, transforming raw wool and silk into objects of desire and social status. This expertise did not die with the Middle Ages. It was passed down mother to daughter, mistress to apprentice in an unbroken chain of knowledge that continues to this day. Consider the modern world of haute couture. We think of it as a pinnacle of modern luxury, but it is actually a medieval survival. The women who sit in the ateliers of Paris today, using needles and thread to create masterpieces for the elite, are the direct descendants of Mabel of Bury St. Edmunds and the silk women of London. They use the same microscopic gaze, they feel the same tension in the thread, and they face the same physical toll of the craft. When we celebrate the high fashion of today, we are inadvertently celebrating the survival of a medieval labor model. The handmade persists because the human heart craves the touch of another human being. A machine can make a dress, but only a woman with a needle can make a story. The unbroken thread also lives on in the struggle for professional recognition. The battle that began in the medieval guild halls continues in the boardrooms and design studios of the 21st century. The seamstresses who fought for the title of mistress were the pioneers of the modern professional woman. They were the ones who broke the invisible ceiling of the home and proved that a woman's place is wherever her talent takes her. Their courage is woven into the fabric of our social progress. Every time a woman today claims her right to her own earnings or stands up for her professional identity, she is echoing the voices of the women who stood in the courts of the 14th century. As the sun sets on our exploration of this forgotten history, we must ask ourselves what we owe to these women. We owe them our attention. We owe them the recognition that they were not just background characters in the drama of kings, but the lead actors in their own epic of survival. They were the ones who kept the world warm and beautiful while the men fought their wars and built their empires. They were the ones who stitched the future together, one precise, painful seam at a time. Their labor was the quiet engine of history, and it is time we heard the music of their needles. Next time you look at a piece of clothing, look past the brand and the price. Look at the seams. Look at the way the fabric moves. Think of the woman who sat in a dim room 700 years ago, figuring out how to make that shape possible. Think of her scarred fingers, her aching back, and her brilliant strategic mind. She is there in the folds of the velvet and the shimmer of the silk. She is the ghost in the wardrobe, the silent partner in our vanity, and the eternal architect of our image. She has never left us. The story of the medieval seamstress is not a tragedy, it is a testament. It is a testament to the fact that no law, no guild, and no machine can ever truly crush the human desire for creation. The needle may be small, but in the right hands, it is a scepter of hidden power. The thread may be thin, but when woven with skill, it is a lifeline that can pull a woman out of the shadows and into the light of history. This is the unbroken thread. It is the story of where we came from, and it is the map of where we are going. As the final stitch is placed and the shears make their last cut, we realize that the journey of the needle is far from over. It continues in every hand that creates, in every mind that rebels, and in every heart that finds beauty in the struggle. The medieval seamstress has finished her work, and now it is our turn to carry the thread forward. Let us sew with the same precision, with the same courage, and with the same defiance. The shadows of the past are long, but the light of the artisan is eternal. We are the inheritors of the silk and the spirit, and the thread is now in our hands.